Story 1. The Lantern in the Empty Loft. I was 16 the first time I decided to climb up into the hayloft of that old barn on my uncle's land. It had been sitting there longer than I'd been alive, its roof sagging, beams leaning inward, and the smell of dust and old hay always drifting out when the wind caught the doors. Folks told me it wasn't safe. Boards could give way, snakes nested in the corners, and sometimes, when the air got heavy before a storm, you could hear the whole place creak like it was sighing. Still, curiosity can gnaw at you worse than hunger, and that summer evening, with the sky turning a pale grey and cicadas buzzing loud in the trees, I gave in and went to see for myself. Inside, the air was thick, warm, and stale. Shafts of fading sunlight poured in through the cracks in the siding, catching dust that hung in the air like smoke. The wooden floor gave a little under my boots, but held. I remember the quiet more than anything. The kind that presses against your ears until you start noticing your own heartbeat. I made my way to the ladder, gripping the rungs with sweaty hands, and climbed slow. Each step thudded against the hollow frame, and it felt like the sound travelled up into the rafters and disappeared. The hayloft was darker than below, the light struggling to reach that high. Straw crunched under my boots, dry and brittle. I took a few steps in, letting my eyes adjust. That's when I saw it, in the far corner, a lantern. Not old and rusted like you'd expect, but glowing, faintly, steadily, like it had been lit only moments ago. The flame inside swayed gently, though there was no breeze. My whole body locked up. The barn was abandoned, the property empty except for my uncle's house half a mile away. There was no reason for that lantern to be burning. Yet, it was. I remember thinking maybe someone was messing with me. Maybe an older cousin had slipped in ahead of me to scare me, but no footsteps, no breathing, no sound at all carried through that place. Just the faint hiss of that lantern flame. I stood there staring, too scared to move forward, too curious to go back. After a long moment, I took one step closer. The light dimmed, like someone had cupped their hand over the glass. I froze. Another step, and it flickered, struggling like it was running out of air. My heart was hammering so loud it seemed to echo in the rafters. Then, as I drew close enough to almost touch it, the flame went out. Complete blackness swallowed the corner, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything I'd ever known. I didn't wait to see what came next. I scrambled back toward the ladder, my boots slipping on the hay, my hands clumsy on the rungs as I half fell down into the lower level. I hit the dirt floor hard and bolted for the doors without even catching my breath. Outside, the air was cooler, the crickets singing loud and the sun dipping behind the ridge. But all I could think about was the lantern and the way it had gone dark the moment I reached for it. I swore right then I'd never go back inside. I kept that promise for years. The barn sat there, sagging deeper with every season, its roof collecting more holes, its doors leaning open like a mouth left gaping. I'd drive past it sometimes on the old gravel road, especially when I was headed back from school or work, and every so often when the night was thick and the only light came from the moon and my headlights, I'd see it again. A faint flicker, glowing through the slats up in the loft, just enough to make me slow the car and stare, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks, but I knew the glow too well. It looked the same as that night, like a flame waiting, patient, steady. I never told my uncle. He'd have brushed it off, told me I was letting my imagination get carried away. Maybe he'd have said it was squatters or hunters passing through, or some kids playing with flashlights. Maybe. But I knew the difference between a flashlight beam and the low, warm pulse of a lantern flame. It had a way of breathing with the shadows, bending them in a rhythm that didn't belong to anything alive. As I got older, I stopped thinking about it as much. Life has a way of filling your head with other worries, but every once in a while, driving that road at night, the flicker would catch my eye, and I'd grip the steering wheel tighter, fighting the pull to stop, because deep down, some part of me wanted to climb back up there, wanted to see if it was still waiting. I never did, and I don't think I ever will. But here's the thing, barns don't keep themselves lit. They don't breathe shadows into corners and snuff out flames at the touch of your step. Whatever I saw that night, it wasn't something I can explain. And if it's still up there, glowing faint through the cracks in the boards, I think it's because it's waiting for someone else to climb the ladder. Story 2. The Whispers Beneath the Floorboards. I remember that summer like it was yesterday, though it's been decades. My cousin and I used to spend hours running around that old cattle barn down the road, a place everyone in the hollow called unsafe but irresistible. The roof sagged low in the middle, the boards were chewed soft by time and rot, and the air always smelled of old hay, dirt, and something faintly metallic that I never could identify. It was the kind of place where shadows clung to every corner and sunlight struggled to reach the floor. We would play hide and seek, daring each other to go deeper inside than anyone else. The creaking boards and rattling tin making every step feel like a secret adventure. That evening, I was feeling braver than usual. I decided to crawl under the loft, beneath the beams where the hay had thinned and the floorboards had rotted through in places. It smelled heavier down there, damp and earthy, like the barn itself was holding its breath. I squirmed under the low beam, dirt scraping my arms and knees, and paused when I heard it. Soft, whispering voices beneath the floorboards. At first, I thought it was my cousin messing with me, trying to scare me while I hid. But the tone was different. The voices were layered, overlapping, almost desperate, like they were trying to reach someone who couldn't understand. They weren't saying words I could make out clearly, only fragments, sighs and murmurs that sounded like pleading. I froze, pressed against the beams, listening. The boards beneath me seemed to vibrate under my palms, subtle at first, then stronger, like something was pressing up from below, alive in a way that made my stomach turn cold. I tried to convince myself it was imagination. Barns make noises, old wood creaks, rodents scurry. But the sound didn't match anything I'd ever heard. It had direction, intent, urgency. I could feel the rhythm of it, the tiny thumps beneath the floor echoing against the hollow of the beams. My heartbeat roared in my chest louder than the whispering. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened and felt the vibrations under my palms. The way the floor seemed to respond to whatever was down there. Something about it told me that this was not part of any game, that it wasn't meant to be found. I was supposed to be unseen, unheard, not touching whatever lived beneath the dirt. Then I heard a familiar laugh above me, and my cousin finally found me. Relief hit me so fast I nearly jumped, and I bolted out from under the beams without saying a word. I didn't even wait for him to ask if I was okay. I didn't explain. I ran into the fading sunlight, the barn's shadows stretching long across the yard, as if trying to chase me. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the whispers that had threaded through the floorboards, about the way the dirt under my hands had pulsed like a warning. I told myself it had been imagination. But the memory clung like a damp smell, impossible to wash away. Years later, when I was in my early 20s, I heard that the old barn had collapsed. They said a storm had weakened the supports, and when the roof finally fell in, it crushed the old floor. But what caught my attention wasn't the barn's end. It was what they found beneath it. Bones, human bones, mixed into the soil under where I had been hiding that night. No one knew how long they had been there, or who they belonged to, or how they ended up buried beneath a barn that had been standing for longer than anyone could remember. I couldn't help but feel the whispering again, that desperate, layered pleading I'd heard when I was 16. The bones confirmed what my gut had known all along. There had been something or someone beneath the floorboards that night, trying to speak to me, and I had run without listening. I think about that evening often, not just the voices or the bones, but the way the barn had felt alive in its silence, how the floor seemed to vibrate and respond, how the shadows pressed close. I've walked past where it once stood, overgrown now with weeds and brambles, and I swear I can still feel the echoes of those whispers when the wind moves the grass. Even with all the years and distance, the sound is impossible to forget. It's subtle at first, almost indistinguishable from the rustle of the trees or the creak of distant farm fences. But if you listen closely, the tone is there, pleading, insistent, patient, like it knows someone will hear eventually. I've tried to tell myself the rational explanations. Perhaps my imagination had been fueled by fear. Perhaps it was just the wind, the boards shifting, some combination of sound and shadow that my young mind had misinterpreted. But the bones tell a different story, and the memory is stubbornly alive. There's a hollowness that stays with you when you know that the earth beneath your feet once held someone or something desperate enough to speak from beyond, waiting to be noticed. It's not the kind of fear that drives you to run in panic. It's quieter, a weight in your chest, a tension in the air. A shiver that lingers when the lights are out and the house is still. It's a reminder that some places hold stories you're never meant to fully understand, and sometimes, even when you leave, they reach for you anyway. I've never gone back. I don't think I ever could. Even when I drive past that stretch of road now, the memory rises up. The wind in the trees makes me jump, and every sagging structure along the roadside carries the weight of all the voices that might lie beneath. There are barns in the hollow that look empty, but I never assume they are. I keep my distance. There's a sense in the old woods, in the empty spaces, that life doesn't end where you see it, and that some things are patient. They wait, they whisper, and they are not always silent when no one is listening. That night in the barn, I learned the quiet way fear can press against your skin, the way you can feel something beneath the floorboards without ever seeing it. I learned that some things can never be explained, and some warnings are not given aloud, only felt with your whole body, the heart hammering, the hands trembling, the mind straining to understand. And sometimes, even when years have passed, the memory comes back in flashes, in whispers through the wind, in shadows that bend just a little too deliberately. It leaves you with questions you will never have answers to, and a hollowness that no passing time can fill. I carry it with me, always. Story 3. The Man Standing in the Stalls. I remember that night as if it's still raining. I had been driving down that back road near the hollow when my truck shuddered and died. It was late, the clouds heavy and low, and the storm had come up quick. Thick rain drumming on the windshield, wind rattling the cab. I tried to restart the engine, tried to push it, but it was no use. I was alone, miles from anything, and the trees on either side of the road bent like they were alive under the wind's weight. I had no cell service, no one for miles, just the roar of the storm and the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the dark outlines of the hills. That's when I saw it, the barn. It was old, weathered, with wide doors hanging crooked, but it promised shelter. Desperation overrode caution. I opened the door and stepped inside, water dripping off my coat, my boots sinking into the muddy floor. The barn smelled of wet wood and old hay, a smell that made my stomach tighten. The rain pounded the roof above, echoing off the beams, and the wind whipped through the cracks with a low, eerie whistle. I thought I was alone. I thought I could sit for a while, catch my breath, wait out the worst of it. I eased between the stalls, running my hand along the rough wooden beams for balance. The light was dim, just the occasional flash of lightning through the slats, but I could see far enough to know the barn was empty. At least, I thought it was. Then I saw him. At the far end, barely in the shadows, a tall figure stood perfectly still. My heart froze. I swallowed hard and called out, voice cracking between relief and terror. "Hello? You? Are you okay?" Nothing. The man didn't move, didn't answer. He didn't even seem to breathe. I squinted, trying to make sense of him. The flash of lightning illuminated him just enough to show the outline, long coat dripping with rain, hands at his sides. And then it was gone. Lightning struck again, and the corner was empty, silent. I blinked, my ears ringing with the storm, but the shape hadn't returned. My relief was tentative. It was still dark, still cold, and the rain still pounded overhead. Then I noticed the footprints, wet footprints, small and heavy, led from where the man had stood, skimming past me toward the barn doors. The mud around my boots squished softly as I shifted, staring at the trail. There was no wind inside the barn, no way for them to have been made except by whatever had been standing there. I wanted to follow, to confront, to see if anyone had taken shelter, but fear held me rooted to the spot. My mind raced, trying to explain it. Perhaps a neighbor seeking refuge from the storm, perhaps someone I'd see in the morning, perhaps nothing at all. But the footprints were real. I could see the impressions, water pooling in the slight depressions of the earth, tracking toward the doors. And yet, there was no one there when I finally dared to look again. I spent the rest of the night in that barn, crouched behind a stack of hay bales, watching the slats and listening to the storm. Every gust of wind, every hammering drop of rain made me flinch. I kept glancing at the corner where I'd seen him, half expecting him to step out of the shadows again, but the barn remained empty. Hours crawled past, slow and unrelenting. The storm eventually lost some of its fury, tapering to a soft drizzle, the thunder a distant rumble, but I did not move, I did not dare. The footprints remained until the first light of dawn, when the rain stopped completely, and when I finally crept toward the doors, the prints had dried, gone, as if the figure had never been there at all. I drove off slowly, mud splashing from the wheels, my mind turning the night over again and again. The memory stayed with me, the strange calm in the figure's posture, the unnatural stillness, the silent weight of someone present without speaking, without moving. I've told friends about it, of course, when the subject comes up, and most of them laugh it off. A neighbor walking home, a trick of the light, a combination of fatigue and storm. I wanted to believe them, I did. But there's something about standing in the dark, soaked to the bone, hearing the rain hammer like fists on a roof, and knowing someone, or something, was there with you, perfectly still, that sticks in the chest in a way that laughter can't undo. I've passed that barn on nights since then. Sometimes, on roads I avoid when the weather turns, I glance out the window and see shadows slanting through the open doors, even when I know no one is there. Sometimes I swear the shape of that man returns in the corners of my vision, just a flicker of movement that vanishes if I look too long. It's not a constant thing, not like a nightmare that won't end, but the memory is sharp, real, and it doesn't fade. And I can't explain the footprints. I can't explain the absence that seemed alive, the emptiness that pressed against the storm. The barn didn't feel abandoned when I was inside. It felt lived in, claimed by someone who didn't need doors or walls to stay dry. Whoever, or whatever, was there that night didn't follow the rules we expect, didn't act in ways that make sense. And that's what keeps the memory alive, gnawing at the edges of logic. Some nights, I lie awake listening to rain on the roof of my own house, and the memory creeps back, the smell of wet hay and wood, The hiss of water sliding down tin, the way shadows stretch too long and still. I think about what it would have meant if I'd followed the footprints, stepped into the storm after him. I imagine trudging through mud, calling out, finding nothing. Or worse, finding the shape still waiting, unblinking, perfectly still, just a presence among the dark. That thought has stayed with me longer than the storm, longer than the roads I drive every day. It is quiet in my chest, a slow burn of unease. Because some things you encounter in the hollows aren't meant to be understood. They are just there, in the shadows, patient, waiting for no one, unbound by the rules of the world we know. Years later, the road is still the same, the barn long forgotten by most. Locals speak of it occasionally, a place avoided in the rain, a roof sagging further with each passing winter. But I cannot forget. I can't unsee the shape in the corner, the wet footprints leading past me, the weight of presence that didn't need to breathe, even now when the wind rustles the trees late at night, when the rain hammers the roof above my head. I can feel it again, those silent eyes watching from a corner, patient, unmovable, leaving me with a question I will never answer. Did I share shelter with a man, a stranger seeking refuge? Or was it something that didn't need the storm to pass through? That night doesn't resolve, doesn't offer closure, only a lingering sense that the hollows are not always empty, that storms can bring more than rain, and that shadows are not always safe to ignore. Story 4. The Chains That Never Stopped Swinging. I was on a late autumn hike, the kind where the leaves had turned crisp and brittle, and every step made a dry, echoing crunch underfoot. I had taken a trail that wound far from the nearest road, deeper into the woods than I usually dared. The wind had died down that day, leaving the forest eerily quiet. Birds were absent, squirrels disappeared, and even the stream I had been following seemed to have slowed, its babble softened to a whisper. I liked these quiet sections of the woods, places that felt untouched, but that day something felt off before I even saw the barn. A heavy stillness hung in the air, pressing against my ears, making me hyper-aware of every snap of twig and rustle of leaves. I stumbled across the barn around mid-afternoon. It was hidden in a small clearing, the kind of place you'd walk by 100 times and never notice if the underbrush didn't part just right. The doors hung open, twisted on rusted hinges, and the sun that filtered through the thinning canopy caught on the peeling paint, highlighting streaks of decay. My first thought was that someone had abandoned it long ago. The roof sagged and the walls leaned, but it was intact enough to hold its shape, as though it had been left in a hurry. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. The smell hit me immediately. Wet wood, rust, and something faintly metallic. Dust motes floated in the weak shafts of sunlight that fell through holes in the roof. And then I saw them. Chains. Iron chains dangled from the beams, some reaching halfway to the floor, swinging slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, I assumed the air had shifted in some small way, enough to set them moving, but the air inside was still. I watched them sway, one after another, and realized they weren't moving randomly. They were swinging in perfect rhythm, like pendulums, back and forth, back and forth. My stomach tightened. I tried to convince myself it was some trick of my eyes, the way shadows made shapes on the walls, the way my brain wanted to find a pattern in random motion. But it wasn't a trick. Each chain swung with deliberate timing in unison, the metal clinking faintly as if keeping some secret cadence. I stepped back toward the door, telling myself I should leave. My heart had started to pound in my chest, a dull, urgent thrum that seemed louder than it should in the hushed barn. And yet, I couldn't turn my gaze away. There was something hypnotic about the rhythm, a silent insistence in the way the chains moved. I didn't dare touch them, didn't dare move closer, but the longer I stayed, the more I felt as though the barn itself was alive, breathing in time with the chains. The stillness outside was nothing compared to the presence in here. It pressed against me, a subtle weight in my chest, as though I wasn't meant to see this. And then I left, quickening my steps back through the clearing, glancing over my shoulder. The chains continued to sway, perfectly synchronized, and I could see the glint of metal catch in the fading light, moving like pendulums in a rhythm that belonged to something else. I didn't tell anyone at first. The story felt too strange, too absurd, even to myself. Maybe it was old iron, warped by years of exposure, swinging in a pattern I couldn't understand. Maybe it was wind I hadn't felt. I wanted it to be something simple, something explainable. But the memory stayed with me, lodged deep behind my ribs, making my skin crawl whenever I thought about that afternoon. Every creak in the woods after that made me flinch. Every shadow between trees seemed to hang longer than it should, and every time the wind moved softly through the forest, I swore I could hear metal clinking, faint and deliberate in the distance. Weeks later, I returned with a couple of friends. I tried to show them what I'd seen, partly out of disbelief, partly because I wanted confirmation that I wasn't imagining things. But when we reached the clearing, the barn was gone. Just a heap of splintered wood and rusted metal, collapsed inward as though some unseen hand had pushed it down. The chains, the rhythm, the weight of the place. It was all gone. I stepped carefully over the debris, scanning for anything that could have explained it. Rusted nails, broken boards, scraps of iron, but no chains swinging, no synchronized clinking. My friends laughed it off, said it must have been some optical illusion or a gust of wind that made the old metal sway. I nodded, forcing a laugh, but deep down, I knew what I had seen. That day, that barn had moved in ways it shouldn't have, in a rhythm I couldn't explain, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been waiting for me. Even now, years later, when I walk that trail alone, when the wind dies down and the forest goes quiet, I hear it, the faint clink of metal. Not loud enough to be certain, but enough to make my stomach tighten. I stop, hold my breath, and listen. Convinced for a moment that the chains are swinging again somewhere in the woods, keeping their slow, hypnotic rhythm. The memory comes back with the same weight it always does. The smell of old wood, the faint metallic tang, the hypnotic motion of the chains in perfect cadence. It isn't fear exactly. It's a strange, persistent unease, the sense that the forest holds more than trees and animals, that some things remain in the hollows long after we think they're gone. I've gone on other hikes since then, explored other abandoned barns and cabins, but none have carried the same presence. None have moved in ways that feel deliberate, as if a memory of something long gone is reaching out through time and space to meet you. I've tried to rationalize it. Iron swinging with the wind, shadows playing tricks, a combination of the mind and isolation. But every detail that day fights that logic. The stillness, the perfect rhythm, the way the chains seem to mark a time that wasn't mine. It is burned into me. It is in my bones. And sometimes, late in the afternoon when the wind falls and the woods are quiet, I swear the sound returns. Soft, deliberate, steady. I haven't gone back to the collapsed barn. I don't think I will. The memory is enough. The forest keeps its secrets, and the chains, whether real or imagined, continue to echo through the hollow spaces of my mind. I know that if I walked that trail when the wind is low, if I listened closely enough, I could hear them again, swinging in time to a rhythm no one else notices. And maybe that is enough enough to remind me that some places don't remain empty, that some memories are not simply memories, but warnings or invitations or reminders that the woods hold a quiet patience, and we do not. Even now, when the air is still and the leaves are dry underfoot, I pause, listening, and I can hear it. Not loudly, not in a way anyone else would hear, but there, if I stop moving, if I let the silence settle around me, faint and deliberate, the clink of chains, swinging in a rhythm that will never stop, a rhythm I cannot escape, a rhythm I will always carry with me. Story 5. The Photograph in the Hayloft. I remember that summer afternoon with a clarity I've never managed to shake, though I've tried countless times to convince myself it was just imagination. My friends and I had set out to explore the old barn at the edge of Miller's Ridge, the one that had been abandoned so long that the boards were sagging and the roof leaned like it was about to surrender to gravity. The smell hit us before the barn came into view. A mixture of damp straw, mold, and something sharper, iron-tinged, that I didn't immediately recognize. The heat of July pressed down on us, and the cicadas sang their endless rhythmic drone as if urging us on. I was 14, and the kind of reckless curiosity that comes with that age made the barn irresistible. We climbed the ladder to the hayloft, my fingers sticking to the rough wood that had darkened and warped over decades. Pigeons erupted from the corners, wings thrashing against the beams, feathers brushing my face. And for a second, I imagined they were angry at us for disturbing something they had been guarding. The loft itself was a cluttered jumble of straw bales, broken crates and shards of glass that had caught the light in strange, almost mocking angles. It was there, hidden beneath a pile of yellowing hay, that we found it. A photograph, curled at the edges, its paper brittle and faintly musty. I picked it up carefully, not wanting to crease it further, and turned it over. There was no writing, no date, nothing to indicate who it had belonged to. When I lifted it into the light, I realized it was a family portrait. A father, mother, 2 children standing in front of the barn. At first, I didn't see the detail that would make my stomach tighten. Their eyes were scratched out, blurred in a way that wasn't accidental. Whoever had owned the photograph had deliberately obliterated them, leaving the faces hollow, staring back at nothing. My friend laughed nervously, saying something about old-timey photography being weird, but even as he joked, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. There was a weight to the photograph, a presence that made the air in the loft seem heavier. I slipped it into my pocket, thinking it might be funny to show to my parents, though I already had a nagging feeling that wasn't curiosity. The ladder groaned beneath our weight as we climbed down, and when we stepped out of the barn, the late afternoon sun seemed almost unnatural, too golden, too still. Shadows from the surrounding trees stretched long and sharp across the clearing, and I could have sworn that, for a moment, something moved behind them, something that wasn't human, yet wasn't quite the wind either. That night, the photograph pressed against my dresser. I couldn't sleep. The image of the family hovered behind my eyelids, their blurred eyes searing into the back of my mind. Around 2 a.m, I woke to the sound of shuffling from the corner of my room, a soft rustling, almost like the drag of cloth across the floor. I froze, heart hammering, telling myself it was the house settling or a dream. But then the air grew impossibly cold, and in that silence, I could almost hear whispers, low, garbled, like children trying to speak through water. I turned on the lamp, the light flickering across the walls, but there was nothing. The photograph wasn't on my dresser. I jumped out of bed, my bare feet cold against the wooden floorboards, and searched the room, calling my parents' names, but only the empty darkness answered. When morning came, I found the photograph smouldering in the corner of my room, a tiny curl of smoke drifting upward, though I was sure I had never touched a match. I picked it up with trembling hands, and it was intact, unharmed. The burning must have been a dream, I reasoned, trying desperately to soothe the raw, anxious feeling curling in my stomach. I burned it properly the next morning, outside in the yard, fire crackling, flames consuming the paper, but even as the ashes drifted into the grass, the image lingered. I could still see them, the empty eyes, the faint outlines of faces, the way their presence seemed to press against my own. Weeks later, we returned to the barn. The curiosity, or perhaps the compulsion, hadn't left me. My friends tried to joke, but their voices sounded hollow, too loud against the quiet of the woods. When we climbed into the loft, it was empty of anything human-made, the hay long gone, the floorboards splintered, and yet the place felt charged, as if it had been waiting. We searched every corner, every crevice, but there was nothing to indicate the photograph had ever been there. Not a scrap of paper, not a bend in the straw. It was as if it had existed solely in the moment we found it, a bridge between that old barn and some place I didn't want to think about. The unease didn't fade. On the walks back home, the forest seemed different. Shadows lingered longer, more deliberate, and branches scraped against each other in noises too intentional to be wind. Once, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, tall and still, staring at me with the same hollow eyes as in the photograph, and when I blinked, it was gone. I told my parents nothing, not wanting to seem insane, not wanting the explanations that would never satisfy what I felt in my chest. As I got older, the memory grew sharper in certain ways. The way the air in that loft smelled, like old straw mixed with iron and something fouled. The way the shadows seemed to stretch toward me even when the sun was high. And the photograph itself, I would see it in corners of my vision, lingering in the edge of reflections, in the glass of windows, in mirrors that had no business holding it. The family, faceless, waiting. Their intent was impossible to discern, but I always knew it was watching, waiting, trying to communicate perhaps, or merely marking me, leaving me haunted without words. The thing that disturbs me most, the thing that wakes me on nights when the wind is quiet and the house is still, is that it didn't end with burning the photograph. Sometimes I wake with the feeling of small, cold hands resting on my shoulders, pressing just enough to make me shiver without pain. Sometimes I hear that rustling, low and wet, near the foot of my bed, and I tell myself, it's the house, it's the wind, it's the memory of a 14-year-old boy imagining things. And yet, I know it's not imagination. It's the barn, the photograph, the family that once stood in front of that building with their empty eyes. It's in the quiet that follows a storm, in the heat of summer afternoons when the woods are still. And I cannot tell whether it is anger or sorrow, or merely a need to be remembered, but it watches. I do not speak of it to friends anymore, though sometimes I catch glimpses of their curiosity in my own reflection, the same reckless desire to reach for the unknown. I have learned to turn away, to avoid the old paths in Miller's Ridge, but the memory follows, like a shadow. The image of that family, the way their eyes were scratched into emptiness, continues to press against the inside of my mind. I think, sometimes, that it will follow me until the day I die. The house settles at night in ways that make me pause. A whisper brushes against my ear, soft and unintelligible. I sit up, heart racing, imagining the loft, the hay, the photograph, the eyes, and for a moment I feel a connection, a weighty, pressing reminder that some things cannot be burned, cannot be hidden, and certainly cannot be forgotten. Even now when I walk through the woods near Miller's Ridge, I feel it, not watching from afar, Not the distant idea of something old and decayed, but close. So close that the air changes, the light falters, the shadows curl toward me as if trying to communicate, and I cannot tell if they are warning me, claiming me, or merely reminding me that memory, attention, and fear can be just as binding as chains. That photograph, the hayloft, the family with their eyes erased, they are all stitched into the timber and the earth, into the small wild forest that will outlast me and everyone I know. And the thought that haunts me most is that I have been marked, watched by something not fully alive, yet not dead, and that their blurred eyes follow me still, waiting for acknowledgement I cannot give. Even after all these years, the sensation remains vivid, immediate, and profoundly unsettling. I hear the rustle of straw when there is none. I catch glimpses of shapes at the corner of my vision that vanish when I look directly. And most nights, when sleep finally claims me, I dream of that loft, that photograph, and the hollow eyes. I reach out, thinking I might comfort them, understand them, apologize even, but I wake before I touch anything. The whispering begins then, soft, urgent, impossible to comprehend, and I lie in the dark, listening, heart hammering, knowing that some part of me will never escape the barn, the photograph, the family that no longer exists, yet persists. And in the quiet, I wonder if anyone else would hear the whisper too, or if it's only ever been for me. The memory is mine alone, and I will carry it to the end, as vivid and demanding as the day I found the photograph in the hayloft. It is a memory that refuses to fade, an echo of something real, something that existed in that barn, in that loft, and perhaps still exists. Lingering, patient, waiting for someone else to find it, to see what I saw, to feel what I felt, and to understand that sometimes looking into the past is not enough. Sometimes the past watches back, and sometimes it whispers. Story 6. The Barn That Breathed. I remember when I first noticed the old barn at the edge of town. Everyone in my little Appalachian community had stories about it, though no one seemed to spend much time there. They said it wasn't just abandoned, it was alive in some way. People spoke in whispers about how the beams groaned in the wind, how the boards creaked in odd rhythms, how sometimes the barn itself seemed to shift as if breathing. I didn't take it seriously. We were kids once, daring each other to go near abandoned buildings, chasing the thrill of imagined hauntings. But that night, that one night, I realized the barn wasn't just some creaky old structure. It was something entirely different, something that didn't belong in the world I knew. It had rained all evening, and the air was thick with damp wood and wet leaves. I was walking home along the narrow road that wound through the forested edge of town, the kind of road where the trees arch so close over the asphalt that it feels like you're walking under a tunnel of shadow. I was thinking about nothing in particular, trying to shake off the creeping loneliness that settled in after dark. That's when I saw it. The barn loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the clouds, wet boards gleaming faintly in the intermittent light from my phone. The air around it seemed to shiver, almost like heat rising from stone, but colder and heavier, pressing down on my shoulders. I stopped because I could hear it, the barn itself making a sound that didn't belong to wood or nails. It groaned, yes, but in a rhythm that mimicked breathing. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. My first thought was wind, but there was none. The night was still. The wind had died hours ago, leaving nothing but the patter of distant rain on the leaves and the uneven rhythm of the barn's sighs. I tried to convince myself it was the boards settling, the old timbers contracting after a wet day, but it was too deliberate, too methodical. It wasn't just a creak or a pop. It was slow, heavy, like lungs filling and emptying, and I felt it in my chest as if I were breathing along with it. My skin prickled, hair standing on end. I remembered the stories, all those whispered warnings, and a cold knot of fear settled deep in my stomach. Every instinct told me to keep walking, to leave the road and find the comfort of my porch at home, but my feet betrayed me, carrying me closer to the source of the sound. Something, some foolish curiosity, some primal need to see, made me step into the puddled path that led to the barn doors. The closer I got, the more I realized the barn wasn't just groaning. It was alive in a way I couldn't describe. The air around it shifted, pulsing in time with the breathing. I could feel warm currents brushing my face, carrying the smell of wet timber, iron, and something else I couldn't place, something earthy, pungent, like soil turned over by hands that had been there a long time. It smelled wrong, unnatural. I hesitated at the threshold, peering inside the dim interior. Shadows clung to the far corners, and the beams overhead seemed to sag with weight, as though the structure itself were exhaling in relief, filling with air just to let it out again. The floorboards moaned under my cautious step, but even that sound seemed minor compared to the slow, steady rhythm of the barn's breath. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn and never look back, but a part of me, a foolish, stubborn part, needed to know if what I was hearing was real. I stepped inside, and the darkness wrapped around me like a damp shroud. The smell grew stronger, and I noticed small details. The way the boards bowed slightly, swelling and shrinking in time with that impossible rhythm. Even the old nails seemed to tremble as though alive. I leaned against a post for balance, staring at the wall across from me. There was no wind, no hidden draft, and yet the boards moved imperceptibly, inhaling, exhaling, a living thing trapped in splintered wood. I realized then that the stories weren't exaggerated. They were warnings, and I had ignored them. As I stood there, frozen, I felt the air shift suddenly, a warm rush from a crack between two boards brushing my cheek. It was like the barn was aware of me, testing my presence, sending a wave of heat and dampness over me. I shivered, the hair on my arms sticking up as if the atmosphere itself were electric. I whispered a curse under my breath, half to reassure myself, half to acknowledge some unspoken rule I'd broken by coming closer. My instincts screamed to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot, as if the floorboards had caught hold of me, reluctant to release their prey. Then I heard it, soft, almost imperceptible, a sound of dragging, of something moving just beyond the edge of the shadows. My pulse jumped. I told myself it was nothing, a branch falling outside, a small animal, anything that could rationalize the noise. But the rhythm of the dragging, subtle as it was, synchronized perfectly with the barn's breathing. It didn't feel accidental. It felt deliberate. Watching from the shadows, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow stretching, bowing, almost merging with the beams themselves. When I turned to look directly, there was nothing, just the dark, just the barn inhaling and exhaling around me. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. I realized I couldn't stay another second without losing my mind. I backed away slowly, each step measured, listening to the barn breathe in response, almost like a conversation in a language I didn't understand. The drag behind me seemed to grow lighter, less insistent, but it was enough to make me run. I didn't stop until I reached the road, panting, soaked in sweat and the lingering damp of the barn. When I looked back, it sat there in the darkness, inert in appearance, but I could feel its presence, pulsing in the night air, slow and steady. I didn't dare go near again, but for nights afterward, I dreamed of it. I dreamt the boards bending over me, the warm air pressing my face into the planks as the building exhaled. I dreamt of stepping inside and hearing whispers, dragging across the floorboards, breathing in unison with the beams. Every time I woke, my chest heaving. I could still feel the rhythm in my bones, as if I had carried part of it with me. Months passed. Life moved on. The barn remained on the edge of my awareness. Something I knew I shouldn't mention, something people would laugh at if I did. But I avoided that road, even in daylight. Even when the sun lit the trees in golden hues, the memory lingered, heavy and stubborn. Once, I thought about returning, maybe with a friend, to see if I had imagined it, to confirm some logical explanation. But I couldn't. Every time I imagined stepping toward it, I felt that same rush of warm air, the pressure on my chest, the slow exhale of wood and shadow, and I knew I couldn't face it again without losing more than my pride. Something about that barn was beyond reason. It watched, it waited, it breathed, and it was patient. Even now, years later, I sometimes walk the edges of the forest when the wind dies down and the night is quiet. I swear I can feel it again. The barn, somewhere just beyond sight. Drawing air in and pushing it out in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I hear it in the silence, in the sigh of the leaves, in the way the shadows bend slightly toward me. No one else ever mentions it, but I know it's real. I know the boards shift. I know the beams groan. I know it breathes. And I know that whatever lives or doesn't live inside that barn, it waits for me to forget, for me to stray too close, so it can remind me that some things in the Appalachian wild are alive in ways you don't want to comprehend. The memory never fades. Even in sunlight, I can feel its lungs around me, and I realize some part of me will never escape the rhythm of that breathing, never escape the feeling that I am somehow still inside the barn, even when the door is miles behind me. The worst part is the knowing that no matter how far I walk, how many roads I cross, that rhythm waits. It doesn't hurry, it doesn't need to, it just exists, patient, slow, and persistent, and I can never truly be alone again. Not in that forest, not in the quiet of my own home, not in the dark corners of my mind. Some part of that barn, some slow, terrible awareness, has lodged itself inside me, and I fear I will carry it forever, listening for its inhale, dreading its exhale, knowing that one day, if I am careless, I might finally step too close, and then, maybe, it will be the last thing I ever hear. Story 7. The Last Horse's Hoofprints. I'd spent most of my childhood in that old farmhouse, running through the fields with the wind whipping through my hair, shivering in the cold when winter settled over the mountains like a grey blanket, and listening to my grandfather's stories about the old barn at the far edge of the yard. He never kept animals there once I could remember, not for decades, and even when he did, they were gone before I had a chance to see them. Still, the barn had a presence, a sort of heavy quiet that seemed almost alive. Its roof sagged in the middle, and the paint had peeled long ago, leaving bare, greying planks that creaked under even the slightest wind. I never paid it much mind, just a relic from my grandfather's youth, a place where dusk gathered and shadows lingered. But there was always something that made me slow my pace as I walked past. Even as a kid, I felt eyes in the rafters, though I never saw anyone. It was late January, one of those bitter mornings when the frost leaves everything brittle and quiet. I had gone out early to feed the few remaining chickens in the smaller coops closer to the house. My grandfather was gone by then. He'd died the winter before, and the house felt emptier than ever, the silence pressing against me like snow on a roof. When I rounded the corner toward the barn, I froze. The yard was pristine, untouched, blanketed in snow so deep It swallowed my boots halfway up my shins, and yet, there, etched into the fresh powder, were hoofprints, perfect, unmistakable, and impossibly new. They led in a straight line from the middle of the yard directly to the barn door, cutting across terrain that no horse could have traversed unseen. There were no breaks, no gaps, just a clear, confident trail, as if some horse had simply appeared. I knelt and traced the edges of the prints with my gloved hands, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Perhaps a neighbor had let a horse wander, though the nearest farm was a mile away, and in this weather, that would have been absurd. Still, the prints didn't stop at the barn. They circled the stalls, wandered up toward the loft door, and then stopped abruptly, as though the horse had vanished into thin air. I could feel the wind picking up behind me, whispering through the leafless trees, carrying the faint smell of damp hay. My pulse quickened. I called out, though I knew no one would answer, my voice swallowed by the mountains. I pushed the heavy barn doors open, the hinges squealing like a voice complaining, and stepped inside. The air smelled of aged timber, dust, and cold, damp earth. Sunlight slanted through the gaps in the boards, casting narrow beams that swayed with the slight motion of the barn. I followed the prints inside, and they were just as I had expected, clear hoof indentations in the dirt floor, circling the old stalls and the loft ladder. The wood creaked under my feet, though nothing moved, nothing shifted. I called my own name, more to reassure myself than anything else, and I heard my voice return, hollow and strange. The barn felt larger than it had from the outside, stretched in odd ways, the rafters higher than memory should allow. I searched every corner, running my fingers along the beams, checking the stalls, looking in the hayloft. There was nothing, no sign of life, not even a mouse. It was as if the prints had been made by a ghostly horse, one that had stepped carefully through the barn and then simply disappeared. The more I stared at the snow-dusted hoofprints, the less sense they made. I was shivering now, but not entirely from the cold. It was a presence, a knowing awareness, something that didn't belong to the earth or sky. I had been raised to believe in superstition only insofar as it entertained my grandfather's stories, but the air in that barn had weight, heavy and impossible, pressing on my chest with each breath I took. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind was strong, rattling the window panes in the old house, rattling the frames like skeletal fingers. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I could hear the faint clatter of hooves across hard floors, slow, deliberate, pacing. I tried to convince myself it was the old heating pipes contracting, or the branches scraping the walls, but the sound had rhythm, unmistakable, and it carried a weight that the pipes couldn't make. My mind raced back to the barn, to the hoofprints circling inside, to the impossibility of their existence. I imagined the horse, massive and shadowed, standing somewhere just beyond sight, waiting. The next morning, I bundled up and trudged out to the barn. The snow had settled overnight, heavy and pristine. But when I reached the spot where the prints had begun, there was nothing. Not a mark, not a disturbance, nothing. The air felt hollow, as if it had exhaled while I slept. I walked into the barn cautiously, the cold biting my fingers as I gripped the doorframe. Inside, everything was as I had left it, still, quiet, untouched. But the imprint of the hoofprints was gone. It was like they had never existed, though I remembered them in excruciating detail, the way the snow had compacted under each step, the curve of the circles, the sudden stop inside the loft. I couldn't explain it. I didn't even try. For a week, I avoided the barn, avoided the field, avoided the route my grandfather had once walked me along. But then, one afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. I invited a friend, someone who grew up nearby, to come see the haunted barn with me. He laughed, joking about ghosts and cold winter tales, but followed regardless, probably out of boredom. When we reached the yard, I kept my eyes on the snow, expecting to see new prints, expecting to feel that heavy presence again. But the yard was blank, pure white and unbroken. The barn looked smaller somehow, weaker, and the boards sagged even more under the weight of ice and frost. We stepped inside together, and the air felt different from before, less oppressive but still chilling. My friend made some joke about horses in the barn, about spirits hiding in the shadows, and I forced a laugh. The floor was hard-packed dirt, the hayloft full of cobwebs and dust. We explored quietly, more out of habit than curiosity, and finally I climbed the ladder to the loft, half expecting to see the horse staring at me from the dark hay. Nothing, just old hay, a broken crate, a few boards missing from the loft floor, letting beams of light slant through like fingers reaching down. The prints weren't there, the stalls were empty, there was no sound but the wind whispering through the gaps, and still I felt watched, though I couldn't say by whom or what. It was late when we left. The sun had sunk behind the ridge, leaving long shadows across the snow. My friend joked about ghosts again as we walked back to the road, but I wasn't listening. I was thinking about the night sounds, the pacing hooves that had followed me home, the impossibility of the tracks, and the absence of any logical explanation. That night, the sound returned, unmistakable, just behind the walls, pacing back and forth in rhythm with my racing heartbeat. I stayed awake as long as I could, staring at the ceiling, but sleep came eventually, heavy and uneasy, and the dreams were worse. In the dream, I was back in the yard, standing at the edge of the barn. The snow was thick, pressing against my boots, and the air smelled of frost and decay. The horse emerged, massive, its dark form outlined against the grey sky. I could see its hooves sinking into the snow, hear the steady thud, but when I tried to look into its eyes, there was nothing. Just darkness. It moved closer, pacing in circles around me, and I could feel its heat even in the frozen air. I woke up with my heart pounding, drenched in sweat, the sound of hooves still echoing faintly like it had followed me through the mountains. Weeks passed. I went back to the barn only once, braving the winter cold, only to find the field empty, the snow untouched. It was as if the horse existed only in the fleeting moments of memory and fear, leaving nothing tangible behind. Yet, every time the wind was still and the night stretched long and quiet, I could hear it, pacing, circling, waiting. The memory of those hoofprints, impossible and precise, stayed with me, embedded into my mind like frost into wood. I learned to live with it, to ignore it, to pretend that the sound I heard wasn't real, but it never left entirely. It was always there, just at the edge of perception, reminding me that some things, even in the quietest, most familiar places, are not meant to be explained. Even now, when I walk through the winter woods where the old barn once stood, though the structure is gone, collapsed under years of snow and rot, I feel the rhythm in the silence. Hooves pacing, circling, stopping just out of sight. I can't see them. I can't touch them. I can only hear, and that sound, persistent and impossible, reminds me that some presences linger long after the snow has fallen and the barns have crumbled. That winter, the winter I first saw the prints, taught me that the world is broader than we can understand, and that sometimes the quietest things are the most dangerous. The horse is gone, but its echo remains, a haunting beat in the bones of the earth, and I know, somehow, that it will find its way back if the snow falls heavy enough, if the night grows cold enough, if the wind dies down just right. And when that happens, I will hear it again, pacing, circling, and waiting.